there's a certain contradiction, that we see in the way we have worked on our foreign policy. You mentioned in the prologue of the book that since independence, India's foreign policy orientation has, always included a very strong commitment to multilateralism. We were the founding members of both the UN as well as its predecessor of sorts, League of Nations. And yet we didn't do enough to excel in one critical aspect of multilateralism, which is winning elections in these institutions. Also, you take the foreign policy as a whole, India has never been wary of engaging with the world. Civilizational examples, trade linkages going back millennia. Even in the contemporary times, we have been very, very active, post-independence, even now. And yet it's common to read in the headlines whenever there's a bilateral visit taking place by an Indian official who's visiting some other country, whether the prime minister or a foreign minister or foreign secretary, that our official is the first one to visit so-and-so country in these many years, in these many decades. Also, I came across an episode wherein India, to the best of my knowledge, opened up its first mission or embassy in Djibouti, where China has its first overseas military base. So we opened up our mission or an embassy very, very recently. So how do you look at this contradiction? We are in the foreground at certain places, but we continue to be in the background, or we continued to be in the background, up till a few years back. So do you think this situation has changed considerably in the last few years? And what have been the reasons if we have changed our outlook towards foreign policy?
Right. First of all, Deepanshu, thank you very much for engaging with me and spending a weekend in the morning. I know for young people, weekends are precious, and you would rather be spending it somewhere else. That said, I'm grateful to you for engaging with me. It shows your interest in books, perhaps, and an interest in foreign policy also, that you are setting aside this time to discuss a book. So I think you've raised several fundamental questions. You see, India's foreign policy aspirations and the resources that we devote to it are not do not match, and that's primarily because as a developing country, there's always a challenge to provide resources for things that you think are external to you. And for many years, foreign policy was something external, something was done outside, nothing to do with the country, etc., etc. So if I can give you an example, when I was the official spokesperson of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs in 2014, the Japanese official spokesperson came across on a visit. So at that time, he met me. And he said that they spent more on public diplomacy and external publicity than we do on our whole budget. So you can see just the magnitude of the difference. Let me give you another example. All of you want us to do well at the UN. And I understand that it's nice to want to do well. So let me just give you a proportional amount of what we spend and say what China spends right now. So China provides, say, about 14.5% of the UN's peacekeeping budget, which is more than 3 permanent members combined, which is, other than the US, if you leave the US aside, China contributes more than UK, France, and Russia combined to the UN peacekeeping budget, which is the bigger budget. The regular budget is a smaller budget. And what do you think? It's approximately about 15%, 14 point something, etc. What do you think we contribute? Take a guess.
10% of what China does?
10% of what China does would be about 1.5%. Siddharth, you have an idea?
3%?
All of you are wrong by a magnitude of 10. You are wrong by a magnitude of almost 10. We contribute about 0.37%. So you want me to compete with somebody who's contributing, I contribute 0.37%. You want me to compete with somebody who's contributing 15%? Try this in any other field and see how it succeeds. And then you'll realize that the sort of things that we are competing against. So that's one is about resources being allocated. That's one area. The other area is that increasingly multilateral organizations are specialized bodies. So you have to invest both in people and in terms of human resources to develop those people who can excel in that area. So what do? We have a very equitable system that says once you do the UN, you have to go to maybe Burkina Faso or to Nepal or wherever else. We have a system of relative social equity in the sense of how comfortable that place is. So if you go to a very comfortable place, which New York obviously is, then you have to make up for it by doing something where, for example, when I first went to New York in the 1990s, and then I said, I'm going to Islamabad. So the point is that you have to, it's purely a indicator of what is available, what is not available, difficulty of lifestyle, living conditions, etc. Now, how do you develop specialists who require to be comfortable in an environment which is like a bubble? So in bubbles, you have to walk with care because there is a sophisticated value system that prevails there. And if you have to do well there, you have to follow and be part of that. But if you just rotate people purely on the basis of equity, which is good, and I don't say it's not good, how do you find that expertise? So let's look at the Russian Federation. Before Foreign Minister Lavrov became foreign minister, he was 10 years their ambassador at the UN. Before that, he was a minister counselor. Before that, sometime he went somewhere else and came back, and he was the first secretary. Now, how do you compete with people who have that sort of expertise and long memories of what happened in X year and Y year and Z year with somebody who's done maybe once in a lifetime? I mean, I was fortunate. The government of India invested in me and said, you can go and leave for 5 years. So I did a deputation with the international organization. So even before I went back to New York, I had already done about 8 years previously in international organizations, which was rare for people with my sort of experience. Generally, you would do maximum 3 plus another 3, 6. Whereas there are other people who've done 8 years, 10 years, 7 years, etc. In our system, expertise is not valued. What is valued is that you need to be jack of all. You don't need to be master of anything. So is again a second area. The third area is beyond foreign policy. We need expertise in domain knowledge and an ability to articulate that in a lingo that international or multilateral organizations can understand. So we have very good domain experts, but they are so occupied in their domains that they are not exposed to international organizations. So they find themselves at ease when they come out. So our nuclear scientists find it difficult to work in an international environment where the IAEA functions. Our agricultural scientists find it difficult to work in the FAO. This happens across the board in any other area. So if you add all these three together, it shouldn't be difficult to gauge why we don't do as well as we can do if we focus and target our goals. But then if you leave those three out, we haven't done badly in many other things, but we could certainly have done better. I take that point.
Got it. So would you contrast it with the US system wherein, domain experts get to be diplomats to those countries or they get to lead those countries? Because this is what a lot of students, we all are starting in United States, and we have been seeing this. multiple professors who teach us, they are teaching us after, let's say, decades of experience, both in the government as well as in that domain as an academic. And that surely helps them in driving negotiations in those areas with the participating countries. So, do you think it's a larger problem of the way we hire our bureaucracy or the way we bring them into the system? Or if that's the case, how do we bring reforms in, especially the foreign service?
Well, it's not only those, but it's a matter of, are you willing to spend the money? Because if you want to uh, incentivize domain expertise, you have to have more people. You just cannot run a foreign policy of about 1,200 or 1,400 officers at best and think that you can compete with the best in the world. It's because you can't do that expertise. You can do it perhaps for the multilateral organizations, and it's not very difficult to do it. But then, how do you do it, for example, for sub-Saharan Africa? What is the incentive for young people to go again and again and again and again to sub-Saharan Africa? They will say, hey, this guy is doing New York and Geneva and Vienna, or Delhi and back again to these. Why should I do this thing? So there has to be a calibrated system of incentives. So you lose something, you gain something else. And unfortunately, neither do we have the financial resources to do that right now, nor do we have the human resources. So it's a factor, again, back to resources.
In this background, sir, of lack of resources as well as personnel, there's another question that comes to the mind, which is, you mentioned in the prologue again that against this background, India's success in the Titanic election tussle of 2017, pending all past precedents, is a good case study, to understand the changing contours of India's recent approach to global fora. So could you describe this change in more detail? What factors, let's say, in other domains such as domestic politics or the government, facilitates this change, especially when the background remains constant? We still don't have as many resources as we should when it comes to foreign service or deploying them abroad. And we also do not have the same amount of monetary resources that we are spending, as well as number of people in the diplomatic service.
Right. So for many years, we had a across-the-board system of saying, cut bureaucracy by 2%. All of you would support it, saying, yes, these babus, they are spending too much money, etc., etc. And I understand it's very logical to think that in some areas you may be able to cut because there are efficiency gains, there is technology, etc., etc. But one of the areas where you cannot cut was India's external relations, because for the simple reasons, external relations is no longer external. In my view, the divergence between external policy and domestic policy is eroding. The issue that Hugo Grotius taught us, that there was an external sovereignty and then there was an internal sovereignty, and the two were sort of solid compartments, is no longer possible. You can look across the board, whether it is climate change and environment, whether it is health, whether it is space, whether it is cyberspace. There are areas where all these differences are eroding. So if you continue one shoe fits all, it doesn't work. So one of the things that happened quite early in the new government was they understood that, look, we can't have a one shoe fits all policy. And so they eased. Another factor was partly also the present foreign minister, who was then foreign secretary and had understanding of this, said, well, we need people to go back one after the other to the same place. So our ambassador in the United States, have a look at him. This is his third posting in the United States. He was there as the first secretary. He went there as the deputy chief of mission in Washington, and he's gone back again as ambassador. Now, obviously, his knowledge of American domestic politics is perhaps unparalleled, just because of the experience he has now, at least 9 years in Washington, D.C. itself. So increasingly, we are having that. We previously used to have it for China. Because we had a fairly large number of people who were exposed to Chinese language, and it was a one country thing, so you could go back. So our former foreign secretary, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, he was first went as a first secretary, he then went as a minister counselor, and then he went as ambassador. So he did 3 times. And it was not unusual for people to do 2 to 3 times for China. It's just because the number of posts in China were limited and the number of people were more. But in New York, etc., everybody wants to go to New York for whatever reason. Some like it as a place, something multilateral arena is exotic, some for personal reasons. Somebody's in school, somebody's in college, etc., etc. So increasingly, we've moved away from a system of we've moved towards a system of increasing expertise. And so that has resulted in more regular, I don't think we've solved the problem fully, but it's become more regular in terms of people investing in expertise. But there still is only in 2-3 domains. For example, perhaps it is in Chinese, it's a little bit in Russian, it's slowly in some other areas, but it still has a long way to go. For example, let's take Arabic. Now, we have about 20 plus countries where Arabic is spoken. So the number of people that you need to go back again and again to that area is very large compared to China, where you have, say, 4 missions or 3 missions. So the number of Chinese speakers doesn't need to be very large for people to gain expertise. But for Arabic, you need much larger, given our interest in labor, in consular issues, etc., etc. You need a much larger pool for people to gain expertise. Then let me ask you this question. Would you go again and again and again to Saudi Arabia? Or, of course, you would don't mind going again and again to New York or to Geneva or to this thing. So what's the incentive for somebody to go again and again and again to Saudi Arabia? It may be important for India. It's not important for an individual. So that factor remains. Also, I think one big change we noticed in terms of domestic politics was a willingness to take risks. Now, that usually happens when a government feels that small issues will not be used to target it. So a willingness to take risks. So sometimes you gain in those risks, sometimes you don't gain. For example, even look at Indian foreign policy in the last 4 or 5 years. Sometimes we gambled in one, like in the ICJ, but we lost in other places. Look at the energy. We tried our best, but it didn't work. Yet, government was able to digest that it didn't work sometimes. Masood Azhar, we tried several times. Sometimes we got lucky. It happens. In international diplomacy, there is no finality because it's always a process, not an event. So if it's a process, you need to continue the process. And let me just give you one example and I'll end at that. If you look at, for example, how long it took the People's Republic of China to become a member of the UN. Their revolution was in 1949. They became a full-fledged member of the UN in 1971. Just imagine if India has to struggle for that number of times today, how much noise will be created in India saying government didn't do this, government is losing, etc., etc. So I suppose from 2014 or etc., they had greater confidence in taking risk because no risk, no win. Sometimes you'll win and sometimes you lose. And this is normal. You can't win all the time. So I suppose stability of government also helps in these things of willingness to take. And we realized very quickly, as you said at the beginning, that our numbers are very small. So when we were contesting in 2017, I calculated we had 117 missions in our 93 countries. And since I pushed that at that time, it's now working. We already have increased to more than 135, I think 138 or something. So it's very good that in 3 years or a little less than 3 years, because I wrote that in 2017, November after we won, saying that, look, this time we won, but we have a challenge. And so November to now is about 4 years perhaps. And in those 4 years, we've increased by about 20, which is remarkable. If you see, we've in the 25 years before that, we wouldn't have done 20. We did a large chunk when the former Soviet Union collapsed and all these new Central Asian republics came into being. But other than that, we haven't done large, but now we are again doing it And so it's again, you need a stimulus, but it also you need somebody to push that stimulus through.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think you've touched upon a very important point that, foreign policy is not a finality, it's a process. There's a lot of gray area involved. It shouldn't become a binary that we are winning and losing, and that's all that we have to see. We shouldn't see the progress. That's not the case. But do you also see that particular notion getting eroded just because the difference between external as well as internal policy is being eroded? Do you see every international contest that India will witness in the coming years as having a much more larger bearing on domestic issues or on domestic discussions? Because if that happens, it leads to an increased amount of pressure, tremendous amount of pressure on the diplomats who are going to work on delivering a verdict for India.
Yes, that's virtually inevitable because of various reasons. Today, when I started studying foreign policy, I was told that your territory, your sovereignty ended about 12 nautical miles after your borders ended, if it was a sea, etc. and all. But today, if you take the smartphone, this is where your sovereignty ends. And virtually everybody has a smartphone. So connectivity has ensured that challenges which were further off have come closer. And sure, now mature countries handle it in different ways. In the sense they understand this, they need to sensitize their populations that, look, there will be some wins and some losses, and you have to be ready for that. For example, lots of people say China has X number of people as heads of UN organization. But China didn't bother. They lost last 2 elections that they contested for heads of UN organizations. They lost in the WIPO. Before that, they lost at UNESCO. Out of 3, they contested 3, FAO, WIPO, UNESCO. They lost 2. So their track record is not very good at 2 out of 3 losses. Yet they are able to manage. And it happens to the best of countries that sometimes the situation is such that you have to bide your time in these matters. So I think we can't make it everything. If you make everything an event, you have to win that event. But if you make it as a process, then you look at it over a period of 10 years or 15 years or 5 years and say, well, we have made progress in that. But to your question that the pressure will come, it'll come both ways. One is that external issues will impinge on your domestic agenda. Similarly, what happens domestically will no longer be domestic. And we've seen in many cases, including the recent farmers' agitation, that global views have a role to play in that. But let's not forget, India is one of the countries which has benefited the most from globalization. If you leave China aside, we are perhaps the biggest beneficiaries of globalization. So you win some, you gain something, you also lose something if that is called a loss. Some people, in fact, argue that perhaps greater pressure from outside may enable change to happen faster in India in some areas where otherwise it would not happen. Many social issues are sometimes, it's the South African model, for example. The South Africans always welcome external induced change because they say our history taught us that apartheid could not have been overthrown only by ourselves. We would only with global pressure, working from outside, tightening the screws, etc., we gained ability to overthrow apartheid. So there are many people who say that many of our social ills perhaps could be faster addressed if there was pressure from outside. There are others who say, of course, look, we understand that these are ills, but leave us to change at our own pace, etc. We don't like foreign influence on this. There are both sides to this argument. I don't know where the equilibrium will lie finally, but this tussle will continue.
Thank you so much for the response, Ambassador. Before I move on to my next question, let's invite a question from the audience.
Hello, Ambassador. I am Mati, and I'm an undergrad student from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I'm so sorry if you hear noises in the background. We are in the shifting process, so apologies for that. But my question is more of a very broad question, not as very specific. But thinking about India's role in today's world, we take pride in the fact that we were once the world's largest economy, historically speaking. But how do you think we can get that position back again? And how do you think citizens can contribute to it? I know you mentioned risk taking in another answer before, but how do you think we can sensitize our people towards those executive decisions? This might sound like a very ambitious question, but I'm asking you given your stellar record of experiences and my firm belief in its possibilities.
Well, Manvi, I must say, even at the best of times, this question is way above my pay grade. But that said, I'll give it a shot. The thing is that, look, along with risk taking, we need to think big. We are a country which is big, but for long has thought small. Primarily because, again, you could give any reason for it, but I won't get into those reasons. But today, the younger group of Indians are not as constrained as we were or our previous generation were. Because when I started as a diplomat, my first experience was we lost to Japan 140 to 40. And that scarred me for life. That, oh, we have to be very careful contesting these elections, etc. and all. But those who are now have seen that, okay, we won this election at the UN, etc. Everybody, all 5 permanent members got together, they couldn't stop us. They have a different background from which they're growing up. Their ability to think big is very different. Your ability to think big is very different. The numbers of you who have gone outside and are exposed to the thinking. Many people once used to say NRIs are not required Indians. But today, maybe you could also look at it in a different way and say that you could be national resources of India, come back, because we need best practices from every area to gain. And it's not only economic. Economic is okay, it's one area and we certainly need it. But what do we need? We need 3 things. We need investment or money, financial resources. We need technology, and we need best practices. And in all those 3, all of you are outside India have a greater role to play than many of us who remain in India. So if there is to be a catalyst, it has to be some of you or many of you who can catalyze thinking, because otherwise we will keep thinking small or fear that change will bring us. I mean, I remember the time when we were joining the WTO. You know, there were huge demonstrations in Delhi, protests by banking associations, and they said the computers will make all of us jobless, or we will all be watching MTV. We won't have any Indian programs, or Amul will not be able to sell its cheese because French cheese is going to come in Khan market, and everywhere everybody is going to eat French cheese and Indian cheese is gone. I don't see how the paneer is gone anywhere. It's just becoming more and more popular beyond Delhi. It's all over South India now. Everybody wants to eat paneer. So I don't see, I mean, but this was the fear then. And despite that, the government said, no, this is it, we cannot. So frankly, as a country, India has always gained from globalization. And always there will be vested interest in India who will say, no, this is, they will frighten us saying that you cannot take on the challenge, others will come and rule you, they will bring back fears of colonialism in a new form, new imperialism, etc., etc. But you are the guys who will do well outside and who have proved. Look at what individual Indians are doing outside the companies. Each of these big companies, so many are Indians. I mean, many of them studied only in India and went out. So there's nothing that we can't do as individuals. It's only as a group we have to get our act together. And for that, perhaps as many role models as possible will be helpful. So if I have to answer in a very convoluted way, I don't think economics. Economics will sort itself out if we get the other things in place. And I've just indicated to you what are the other things. How we do it, I don't know. I'm of a lost generation. You guys are of the next generation. But what I've seen in my lifetime of how we've improved just fills me with hope that you guys will do much, much better than what we've been able to do.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful answer. And just a personal request, because I'm sensitive of others' times as well. How can I connect with you to learn more about this, or separately from this event, if that's possible at all?
Yeah, sure. My email is available with the organizers. They can share it with you. And in this day and age, connectivity is never a problem.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I'll put sir's email ID in the chat box at the end of the session. We can take it from there. Next question is from Kanika. Kanika, please go ahead with the question.
Thanks. Good evening, sir. And I just wanted to ask something which follows from your last response, and how you gave an example of how, when we signed the WTO agreement, and there were some questions about how globalization might affect our local economies. But now increasingly, I'm seeing that after, the Prime Minister has announced the mission of self-reliant India, or Atmanirbhar Bharat, we are again, while we are trying to localize global supply chains, we are also trying to push domestic markets. So where does that balance lie into how much we can protect our domestic space and say that, okay, we're trying to localize the global supply chains, and to a point where we say, okay, this is not just protecting your domestic sphere, but cutting it off and going against the agreement that we have signed. Because a lot of the spaces we are stopping imports, or we are trying to bring in policies that give benefits more to the domestic investors. So how do we make that balance come into place when we're talking about trade in that sense?
So, Kanika, this is not only an Indian phenomenon. This concern of being unhinged from our roots, losing jobs, getting overwhelmed by outside forces. You look all around the United States. It's there in some measure or the other. The trade measures that President Trump imposed have not yet been fully lifted by President Biden. And it's not only the United States. There are many other countries who are suffering from this, because this, some people say, is a reaction to the globalization winds that were blowing. But you see, for a country like us, we were pulled in, crying, kicking, grumbling. We went into globalization in the 1990s. And at the end of it, we were saying, why are you blocking it? Because we had then learned the ways of the game. And when we were just ready to move on with it, the game came unstuck. And now you're saying, yes, true. There is in India also that stream. So it's a global stream, which is normal for a country like India to think, because we are a continental economy. Many people will argue that, look, we can easily sort it. Otherwise, we don't need the world because we are such a big economy. This is an old debate that has always gone on. But the people who don't want greater engagement say, look, if we don't strengthen our house first before we open up, the wind will take away everything from us. We won't have anything left. It's an argument. It's an argument which sells because not everybody, if I may say, calculates with their mind. Many calculate with their heart too. And the appeals to other than those who calculate with their minds is strong also. So, I mean, it is true that we have been among those who have been infected by that bug, if I may say. But given that our track record will indicate that we have on balance been better off in a globalized world than an insular world. And it's not only now. Much of India was trading with global ports well before. So it's bound to move on, and we will change. Those who are making it difficult now will not always be there to make it difficult. It's happening in our agricultural products. Today, we are an agricultural surplus country in some areas. Yet, we can't export too much because we have subsidies built into it, and you will fall afoul of your global requirements because you say you're only subsidizing marginal farmers for their subsistence. Then people say, why are you exporting it to us? Because then you're subsidizing it. So the laws of economics will catch up with us. It's a matter of time. Be patient. We have many issues, and one of those still remains a global current of sensitivity towards opening up our economy, even though our track record says that we would do better.
Thank you so much, sir. And just wanted to also add that the whole movement, for bringing businesses here, while it may sometimes look like we're just trying to promote domestic, we're trying to make international domestic, and that's something really good to see. Thanks so much.
Next question is from Chirayu. Chirayu, please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, sir, as always, for years of your service and leading from the front. Thank you also for indulging quite young minds. And most importantly, thank you for documenting this whole thing. I think in the last 30 years, apart from Bare Khan and Ambassador Puri, I think this is the third detailed insight into the workings of the UN. So it's a very important scholarly contribution for people like us who study India at the United Nations. So thank you for documenting it and giving us this peep. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to say that I would be perhaps the first to review it academically. So with International Affairs in the January version, I'm writing an review which would be upcoming. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in that concluding paragraph is the most important or the most crucial upshot for a student of UN like me from this particular volume is the adversarial structural relation in which India is tied with the P5 at the United Nations, which is very much apparent that the non-national nomination what a Chinese judge got from the United States and India did not get, despite we being the Quad partners. And that concluding thing tells a lot that bilateral relationship is one thing and multilateral relationship is one thing. Now, if I connect the wisdom that you have set out, and those who are really interested in India at the United Nations, I would strongly recommend to read the book. And in the concluding parts that you write that, and if I connect that dot, the wisdom that you have given there with what Kishore Mahbubani once wrote about India, and he said that the only way India will be able to make into this club is by posing a Hobson's choice against the P5 country. In a way, he's saying that either there has to be an exogenous shock, or India has to say that, okay, if you don't include me, I would not be a part of this club, or I don't accept your order as legitimate. What do you foresee? How do you see India breaking into the club? I mean, given the years that you have spent in multilateral diplomacy, how do you view it? Do you agree with Mahbubani's Hobson's choice, or do you have any other way of putting it? How do you see it, sir?
So yeah, it's a very difficult question. And if you look at it, Chirayu, from a historical perspective, all change has been affected of a fundamental nature till now has been affected due to cataclysmic change. International organizations, by definition, are laggards. They are slow moving. I gave you an example of how long it took China to come into the system. So all international organizations change only through cataclysmic change. So your point now is, what is that trigger that will bring about change? There are two ways of, again, looking at it. One, cataclysmic changes that you say, well, we just bide our time, and when the system doesn't work, it collapses, etc. Or the other thing is you make it collapse. So you have two options basically in this. The first option basically means that there is no human element in this. There are certain forces which will inevitably move in one direction or the other, and there is no human elements don't play a role. I'm not one of those who would totally go by that because human resources and individuals to play a role. But I also take the point that they need other circumstances to be in place. So what do we know and what do we need for ourselves? If we grow at 8% an annum for 30 years, I don't see how anybody is going to stop us. Because by then, if we do that, we are already key to any decision on environment. We will be key to any decision on economic issues. We will be key to, increasingly, we are seen as key to decisions on human health. We've seen vaccines when we couldn't produce, Africa couldn't get the vaccines that it needed, despite everybody promising them, etc. Similarly, if AMR increasingly becomes an issue, and it is, and by AMR I meant antimicrobial resistance, which many say is the next big public health challenge. If that happens, if India doesn't get it right, it's going to be very difficult in a world of mobile Indians. So we are in some areas already key players. So if you name top 5 players in several things, yet we are not in the arena of peace and security. That's largely also because we haven't moved down that path. Our default position in most cases is, let's stay neutral. Let's not get into it because, we have a fear that sometime it'll come and bite us if we are less than neutral. So let's be neutral on everything. So our default position is every time abstain. So you're neither on one side or the other. But if you do that, people say you're not part of the solution. So we have to start becoming part of the solution in several ways. In climate change, we've tried. We started the International Solar Alliance. We have a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure. We are saying that we will increase our renewables, etc., etc. So people are saying, yes, India is playing a role. But in provision of global public goods, we have to be net contributors. For long, we have been like piggybacking on somebody else. And there was a time it worked. Now, if you have to be seen as a contributor, you also have to step up in international peace and security. We haven't done that. And so we shouldn't think that we just walk out. Let's also try the path of being positive contributors and see whether it works or not. And if it doesn't work, there's always the path of walking away, saying that I did A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but it still hasn't worked, so I'm now walking away. So I would think between cataclysm and walking away, there are still some steps to take. If we take that, let's see where it goes. I'm a little bit more optimistic that things can change. It won't change in a sudden manner, but it can in an evolutionary way clearly indicate that change is possible.
Thank you, sir. Deepanshu, if I can have a quick follow-up on that.
Sure, please.
Yeah. You raised the issue of UK and France in this book, and France perhaps lost its first ILC election, I think, as you documented. UK lost its ICJ, and we know both of these are waning powers. They haven't exercised veto since '89. Do you think, and they were, I think, perhaps the first to endorse within the UN us as the future permanent member. So do you think that because they want to protect their own powers, they would be the first to endorse us, and in future these reigning powers could be our best multilateral allies?
And that's absolutely true. They are looking at it in a 50-year time frame. They feel the earlier this is sorted out, in whatever way, they also know that it will never be in a way that we are fully satisfied. So their hope is the earlier you get it done. And this has always been the hope of most people who gain the most from the present system. They want a quick solution so that their interests are not undermined, because they know as time moves on, as you said, both UK and France are powers on the way. Also, let's not forget that the Russian Federation, despite its huge defense potential, is not a power on the rise in purely economic terms. If you look at it in GDP terms, etc., it would be like it would not even be in the top 10 countries in the world, because it is largely an exporter of natural resources and defense equipment, etc., but not very much more, given also its falling population, etc., etc. There is a threat to it also down the line, but yet it sees itself as a guardian of, because its one point philosophy is that I gained membership when 25 million of my nationals were lost. It was a cataclysmic change. So unless another cataclysmic change comes, I'm not ready to give up anything. But it's not the same thinking. I mean, French and the UK, but they are more sophisticated in their approach. So they say, let's solve it. Let's give India something, some countries like India something less than where they are. And let's close this so that for the next 25, 30 years, there's no more threat. So you're right that the UK and France will be, but what they say doesn't mean very much increasingly. So you may gain their support, and that's been there on the table for the last, say, 15 years. Your challenge is the new rising power, which is China. And unless you work out a modus vivendi there, it's not going to happen in a hurry.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chirayu, and other people for the interesting questions. So we'll move to one last question from my side, and then as per time, we'll see if we can invite more questions from the audience. There's a very special incident mentioned in the book. It's a very interesting incident, wherein it is to be decided whether we should negotiate, with the UK, with the Britishers or not, and whether we should reach a deal with them, even when the elections result hadn't been announced. This was partly driven by the fact that we were up against a P5 nation, and we had somehow managed to get a moral victory. So we wanted to be, at least some of us wanted to be, let's say, satisfied with that. And we saw two camps emerging in this situation, wherein one was in favor of cutting a deal and the other was in favor of taking it till the last breath. And you mentioned that the old timers in diplomacy, as also mentioned by the then External Affairs Minister, late Ms. Sushma Swaraj, that the old timers in diplomacy and in the government favored cutting a deal, whereas the younger guns, the young ones and let's say the more inexperienced ones, they favored a contest. So is this risk-seeking element on the rise amongst our young diplomats along with the government as well? And if that is the case, do you also see result of this change in the Indo-US relations, wherein we see the older diplomats who were, let's say, justifiably rooted in the Cold War era, wherein US was not reliable at all? Do you see the effects of this particular change also in the bilateral relations that we have, especially the newfound bilateral relations, the one that we have with the US?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you've touched on an issue which is the challenge for us. Like you said, it's not only those who were old who were reticent, because they were going again by historical precedent. They were saying there's no historical precedent of this sort. Why are you doing this? Even among the younger ones, those who dealt with all the others on levels of equality, on economic issues, on social issues, they were the ones who were saying, no, we can do it. But the ones who were used to dealing with, say, the permanent members on peace and security issues, they were saying, why are we taking on the P5? It was the similar in our foreign service establishment. People were saying, let's trade it off for something else. What will you do with this? Now, it happens all the time. And what you're saying is happening even in the area of bilateral relations. Many people say, we can't trust the US. And whenever they ask me, I said, well, two of the biggest achievements that we did in the last few years, we couldn't have done without the US. And on those two, I meant one was we would never have got Masood Azhar listed as a global terrorist, but for US support. And without them, we did a lot. We came up with the ideas, etc., but they did the heavy lifting. Similarly, on the waiver of the nuclear waiver for the first time when after the Indo-US agreement, but for US heavy lifting, we couldn't have got through. Similarly, after Article 370, if the US hadn't intervened on our behalf, we would have had a much difficult time in being able to push China back. So in recent times, in several areas, we've seen where our interests are coalescing. Now, you can still, there are people with memories, 1971, the 7th Fleet came, etc. and all. Whereas the younger people don't have those memories. They're saying, look, from our experience, this seems to be better. And this will remain a challenge of an old guard versus the new guard, of those who are, and that's why I said, you are unbridled. You have greater possibility of taking risks, but also moving ahead. You may not win all the time, but nothing ventured, nothing won. So I take your point, and I think you've hit the nail on the head by saying that this is also seen in other areas, and the divide is the same.
Thank you for the response, sir. I want to ask you if we can take one last question from the audience. Katyani, please go ahead. Katyani is a student of international relations, sir. She's studying at Tufts right now. Katyani, please go ahead and ask the question. Let's do a quick one, Katyani.
Thank you, sir, for your insights. I just wanted to ask one question that you mentioned in the book, that this particular instance of Indian judge getting elected was a deviation from the norm of the ICJ. In the light of this, I want to ask how long-term sustainable was this change in the normative framework, and how we, with our available resources, can go about making changes at the normative level in which these multilateral organizations operate. Thank you.
Right. So it's sustainable for the simple reason, in 6-7 years' time, there will be again a vacancy for an Asian judge too. So this issue of we occupying a seat which is not ordinarily by a nation will perhaps be, I don't know whether it'll ever in the near future, whether it can be replicated. It's a one-off situation which happened, whether you call it luck, fortune, God's grace, something more than we put in the effort, but something else is there in that. But in the long term, it's sustainable. And you're right, for it to be sustainable, we have to start contributing in norms. So again, it's not a very comfortable situation where we are in. For some years ago, we had a young guy at the International Law Commission 4 years ago. Now, for whatever reason, there was a controversy about him being selected, etc. Anyway, he was young, and I had hoped that this guy is being elected. Now, for the next 15 years, we can groom him, and he will be ready as the next level or whatever. Now, suddenly we changed him to another person who may also be good, but it doesn't show that we are looking at the long term. It's the same government, it's the same system, which said, well, this guy was good 5 years ago and he won by a huge majority. Now, why are you changing him? Because he was starting to understand and contribute. Because otherwise, international legally, we've been averse to contribution in terms of norms. So while it's important to have our judge on the court, we also need to start contributing in terms of global norms in the legal sphere. Otherwise, it will be sheer muscle power, that we are there. And it's not that you can't be there, because there are others also with sheer muscle power without contributions being there. But do you want to be known as a normative power, or do you want to be known as just a big country which throws its weight around? And I think in the long term, it's better to be seen as a normative contributor, because it only strengthens a big country's role if you are also seen as a normative contributor.
Thank you so much, sir, for your response.
Thank you so much, sir, for the response, and thank you so much for participating in this and agreeing to host this session. Also, I'm sure that I went through the articles that were printed in the English media after the loss that they had witnessed, and simply going by the tone of the articles and the way they reacted to it, I'm sure that it would have been interesting to see what kind of conversations did Indian diplomats had with the British diplomats after the incident. And we also know that you were also the key architect of the UNSC election victory, apart from the one in ICJ. So it will be really interesting to see if you write a book on that as well. And we look forward to hosting you again on multiple other works that you would take up. We wish you the best of health, and thank you so much for joining the discussion today and enlightening us.
Thank you very much, Deepanshu. I'll just leave with one thought for all of you. How different the British are from us. We are critical of them in some areas, but when I wrote the book, who was the first to come and ask for engagement with me? It was the British Foreign Office. They said, look, we want to learn from where you are. So they got an Oxford professor to moderate a 1-hour discussion with their international organizations division, their India division, and their international law division. So, I mean, as a mature foreign office, they're looking at 10 years, 15 years down the line, unlike many others who say, well, we've done and dusted it, we've won it, etc. They understood that they made mistakes and they're ready to try and rectify it in a longer term. So that's something for us to take away from mature countries, how they adapt to loss and victory. For them, it's the biggest shock of their generation that they lost a seat, which they've never lost for 100 years, because they were also in the predecessor to the ICJ. So by that said, it's been interesting to engage with all of you. I wish you all the best. And once again, thank you very much for spending again a weekend morning on intellectual pursuits of an esoteric nature. But if I've been able to respond to you in some ways, I've had my evening's work done. So all the best to you, and hope the world is a small place. Our paths may intersect some place or the other. And until then, all the best to all of you.
Thank you so much, sir. Also, as a parting note, if you could tell us one book on foreign policy that all of us must read. I know it's a difficult question also because there is no one go-to book, but just one book that comes to your mind right now that we can learn from.
Well, I mean, on India or
any
on
topic, sir. Yeah, India.
Well,
India and the world.
On India, I would suggest that all of you should read Vijay Gokhale's book, The Long Game. It's about India and China, but it shows the way we negotiate in some measure, and the way how others negotiate. It's a good starting point to understand our strengths and weaknesses, others' strengths and weaknesses, and how we've changed. So something new, if you want to read, look at Vijay Gokhale's The Long Game as a good starting point to see how India negotiates. Sometimes India comes into the game very late. And because we all want to hide behind, we are all goody-goodies, we want others to do the dirty work. In life, nobody does the dirty work for us. We have to clean up our own, whatever mess we create. So it's a good starting point to start off with. But there are many books. Dr. Jaishankar's The India Way is another good book on India in a historical sense, etc., giving continuity amidst change. So there's no dearth of book. There are lots of them coming up that will keep you occupied, not for 8 times that you've had, but for 80 more times. So you have lots of food for thought.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Namaste. Thank you so much.
Namaste.